Department counterterrorism chief was so frustrated by the Pentagon's reluctance to think about using military force against Al-Qaeda targets that he told Richard Clarke, does Al-Qaeda have to attack the Pentagon to get their attention?
Hi, I'm Mike Hurley.
I'm Barbara Gruey.
We're the hosts of the Are We Safer Today podcast. In this podcast, we speak with members of the 9/11 Commission staff about their unique experiences in the investigation into the 9/11 attacks.
The 9/11 Commission was chartered by Congress to investigate the most significant attack on American soil since Pearl Harbor. Supporting the work of the commissioners, the commission's staff was tasked with reconstructing a complex jigsaw puzzle. What led to 9/11? What happened on that day? What should we do about it? But unlike a typical jigsaw puzzle, the pieces were not in a box. There was no image of what the solved puzzle would look like, and many of the pieces were missing. I'm Barbara Gruey.
I'm Mike Hurley, and this is the Are We Safer Today podcast. Last episode, we talked with Alexis Albion regarding her investigation of the CIA's handling of the Al-Qaeda threat prior to 9/11. But the CIA, the FBI, and other national security-related agencies operate within the policy and procedure directions of the specific presidential administrations under which they work. To understand how successive administrations may approach a national security threat differently, the Commission had to investigate how both the Clinton and George W. Bush administrations individually responded to the rising threat of Al-Qaeda. Our guest in this episode, Warren Bass, is the man who had significant responsibility for that aspect of the Commission's investigation. For many reasons, Warren Bass was the perfect person to tackle this part of the puzzle. He holds a PhD in history from Columbia University and an MSc from Columbia's Graduate School of Journalism. He received his BA from Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. He has been a senior editor at the Wall Street Journal, working on Review, the paper's weekend ideas section, has worked as a newspaper editor, a speechwriter for multiple administrations, and is an author. He's currently serving in the Biden administration in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, but he's here strictly in a personal capacity to discuss his role on the Commission.
We would like to thank our sponsor, Carnegie Corporation of New York. The philanthropic foundation supports innovations in education, democratic engagement, and strengthening international peace and security. Learn more at carnegie.org.
We would like to thank the Wilson Center for sponsoring the Are We Safer Today podcast. The Wilson Center is the nation's key nonpartisan policy forum for tackling global issues through independent research and open dialogue to inform actionable ideas for the policy community. Warren Bass, welcome to the Are We Safer Today podcast. As you know, Warren, we're speaking with members of the 9/11 Commission staff about their experience in the investigation into the 9/11 attacks. Let's start with the job that you did. Can you tell us what was your role on the 9/11 Commission staff investigation?
Well, Mike, I worked for you. I was a member of what we called Team 3, which was the team that was investigating the high policy story of how the Clinton administration and the George W. Bush administration handled counterterrorism and the threat of Al-Qaeda in the run-up to 9/11 and in the immediate aftermath of 9/11.
Do you remember, Warren, where the designation, the name Team 3 came from?
We were just numbered 1, 2, 3. I think it was in the statute that listed out what the areas of investigative responsibility were.
Policy may have been the kind of the third item in the mandate that we were to investigate.
But first in our hearts.
Yeah, for sure.
And we were supposed to look into this background story about how both of these administrations had been dealing with the threat running up to it. We had a series of colleagues who had different portfolios, including Alexis Albion, who was working on the CIA, Scott Allen, who was working on the State Department, Bonnie Jenkins, now Undersecretary of State Bonnie Jenkins, who was working on the Pentagon portfolio. And because I had no particular skills or expertise, I got the leftover portfolio, which was the National Security Council and the coordination that the White House and its national security bureaucracy, which is called the National Security Council, how it was handling Al-Qaeda.
So you came from an academic background, Warren, with a PhD in history from Columbia.
How do you get from that to the pathway to the 9/11 Commission? How did that happen?
Well, there was a slight fluke in that my dissertation was in part funded for a year of research by the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. And the head of the Miller Center was Philip Zelikow, who went on to become the executive director of the commission. So I knew Philip through the work on my dissertation. My dissertation was about the Kennedy administration in the Middle East, and he had some sense of my work, and I guess he thought it was up to par.
What about the training as a historian? How did that influence the work that you did on the commission? Was it good preparation?
I have often thought that the working on the commission staff was the only practical real-world application for a PhD in history. And there were a few of us. There was Philip, who was himself a quite distinguished academic historian who'd also worked in government a few times. There was Alexis Albion, who was a Harvard history PhD. And there was the late, great Ernie May, who had been a mentor to Philip and some others, who came and helped us out as a consultant. And one of the things that historians bring is a sense of narrative and storytelling and a sense of the importance of evidence and of building your narrative block by block based on the available evidence that you can get, ideally from documents, because the documents are not always entirely complete, but they give you the best contemporaneous snapshot you can get of what people were thinking, how people were acting, what people were pushing. And memories improve upon themselves over time, as historians know, that the little stories that you may hear over the course of this podcast probably were a little more ragged when they happened in real life, but as we've retold them over the years, they get a little more polished, a little more artful, and historians fight against that. Historians want to get back to the ugly messiness of the truth as it was lived by the actors and the participants in the context of the times.
Warren, unlike many of the commission staff, you had no experience in government service prior to your work on the 9/11 Commission. How did that affect your work, and was that an advantage or a disadvantage?
I think in the grand scheme of things, it was probably a disadvantage. It was certainly helpful to be surrounded by very seasoned colleagues who had worked in various executive branch positions before. Mike, who was our team leader, had worked on the NSC staff himself during working on issues in the Balkans and had his own government background. And it was very helpful to have that. I think there is a certain outsiderness that wasn't a terrible thing for the purpose of this unusual government project, where in trying to think through what would make this accessible and engaging, above all to the families of the 9/11 victims, it was not a terrible thing to have someone who wasn't completely marinated in government and sort of had a bit of outsider perspective and can try to make sure that we weren't falling just into Washington speak and could try to make sure that it was fairly plain spoken. But on balance, I'm hard-pressed to advertise inexperience as a virtue.
I think when you came in, you had to get clearances. You were going to have access to highly classified information, which came with a whole set of rules and responsibilities. What did you think about those rules and responsibilities and the challenges they created in doing your work?
Well, because I had the NSC and White House portfolio, we were working under some even more intrusive rules that the commissioners had worked out with the Bush White House, and those were quite intrusive. In my portfolio in particular, the Bush White House wanted to preserve what, since the Nixon administration, has been a certain penumbra of what's called executive privilege, in which presidents have wanted to preserve the privacy of the advice that they get from their advisors. But the Bush White House was very concerned about us delving into what the National Security Council had done or not done. They weren't thrilled about the whole commission, but they were particularly concerned about us getting into White House business. And they had a series of additional rules which I had to work under and which did not speed up my workday.
Warren, there was also, I think you were one of the folks that, because you came in without having government service, that there was probably a time you were working on the commission before you had gotten your full clearances. What did you do during that interim? How did you prepare yourself for when you'd actually be able to dive into the classified material?
So I had been working on counterterrorism issues up in New York at the Council on Foreign Relations, where I'd been a fellow and had been running a post-9/11 program that was trying to help the American public think through a little this new and quite frightening series of issues posed by 9/11. So I had some seasoning in it from an outside government perspective. And I just tried to get up to speed to the maximum extent possible with what was published and in the public domain before actually getting into the classified stuff.
Just following down that a little bit, too, there was some really excellent reporting on the 9/11 attacks by the Washington Post and the New York Times, people like Bart Gellman and others. Was that helpful at all to you in preparing for your role?
Yeah, I think good journalism is always helpful. I have worked as a newspaper editor myself and therefore have a huge and shameless conflict of interest. But Phil Graham, the former owner of the Washington Post, used to say that journalism was the first rough draft of history. And I thought of the commission as being a very interesting, somewhere between a second and a third draft of history. We don't have decades of distance from the events, but we had extraordinary access to documents, which made it different from what journalism can usually do. We had subpoena power, which let us prize out even more information, which journalists would by and large love to have but don't have. And we had tremendous access to policymakers who had to talk to us even when they weren't super happy about it.
We would like to thank our sponsor, Carnegie Corporation of New York. The Philanthropic Foundation supports innovations in education, democratic engagement, and strengthening international peace and security. Learn more at carnegie.org.
We would like to thank the Wilson Center for sponsoring the Are We Safer Today podcast. The Wilson Center is the nation's key nonpartisan policy forum for tackling global issues through independent research and open dialogue to inform actionable ideas for the policy community.
Warren, you talk about all of these materials you read in advance before you could get your eyes on the prize, the real materials. Were there any big surprises between what you read before you got to look at the real materials?
So the first thing is that there's nothing magical about classified information. It is information whose unauthorized release is deemed to be damaging to the national security of the United States, and that's why it's kept classified. And depending on how damaging its unauthorized release would supposedly be, that determines how highly classified it actually is. Some of the most highly classified stuff at one point in time is widely known public domain information at a later point in time. The battle plans for World War II used to be incredibly highly classified, and now you can probably find them all online. The material isn't exciting just because it's classified. What I did find was that there was a pretty rich record of what the National Security Council in particular had been doing on Al-Qaeda in the run-up to 9/11. And in part that was because Richard Clarke, who was the White House counterterrorism coordinator in both the Clinton administration and the pre-9/11 Bush administration, was quite careful about leaving a good bureaucratic trail, was a good writer, was a vivid briefer, was someone who wanted to be sure that his side of the story was being pushed as aggressively as he could, and was trying to compete for the time and attention of policymakers who were busy with about a million other things in their inbox. And he was trying to make the attention boldly as boldly as he could to very busy people about why his particular bureaucratic fiefdom deserved their attention.
You keep talking about the National Security Council. I'm not sure that all of our listeners are familiar with what the National Security Council is and how it operates. Can you just give us a quick little understanding of that?
Sure. So the National Security Council is actually two things. The first is a full-blown meeting of the cabinet officers who work on national security when chaired by the president. So that would include the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Treasury, who does a lot on sanctions, the intelligence community, the head of the FBI. That would be the full-blown National Security Council.
So Warren, it's a group of top policymakers rather than a particular physical place. It's a group of people.
It is confusingly also a staff within the White House, which is led by the president's most senior national security advisor within the White House staff. Currently, Jake Sullivan. Back in our time period, it was Sandy Berger for President Clinton and then Condoleezza Rice for President Bush. That national security advisor leads a small team, a relatively small team within the White House that is supposed to coordinate the national security policymaking apparatus across the entire U.S. government, which means coordinating the efforts of the Department of State, the Department of Defense, the intelligence community, the Treasury Department on sanctions, the Commerce Department on issues of American businesses.
And each of these different departments might have their own perspectives, hence the need for coordinating a policy to come out of these various perspectives.
That's exactly right, that there will be moments where the State Department will say, well, we want to go ahead with the following diplomatic outreach, and the Defense Department will say, actually, that's a terrible idea. We should not be doing that. We should be thinking about a covert action response. And the CIA could be saying, by the way, that's a terrible idea to be thinking about covert action, which we do. We should be thinking about the use of military force, which the Pentagon does. So there can be, when it works really well, it's a good symphony and you have a good conductor who's bringing it all together. When it doesn't work as efficiently, you get noise and squabbles, and it's the job of the NSC to make sure that you get music rather than squawking.
And how well did that process work in the couple of years prior to 9/11?
This is a terrible historian's answer, but the answer is it depends. There were these decision points presented themselves to policymakers over the course of a series of events. There were many, if not most Americans who hadn't really heard that much about Al-Qaeda before 9/11, but there were certainly groups within the U.S. government who did nothing but work on Al-Qaeda in the run-up to it and who were trying to share their sense of alarm about Al-Qaeda with their colleagues who were working on different issues. And there was a big sort of head-snapping moment for the U.S. government on August 7th, 1998, when Al-Qaeda operatives simultaneously blow up the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. That's mostly where our investigation started.
Let me just add on that point to remind people that I think there were a total of maybe 12 Americans who were killed in those two attacks. I might have the numbers slightly wrong, but there were something like 5,000 Africans who were injured, and I think over 200 who died as a result of those attacks.
That's right. And of those hundreds who died, many of them were what are known as Foreign Service nationals, which means Kenyans and Tanzanians who were working for the American embassies in their respective countries and who had done nothing worse than show up to work that day and got blown up by bin Laden and his henchmen. And this was something that the State Department leadership were horrified by. Secretary of State Albright remembered August 7th as one of the most difficult days of her entire storied career. It was something that was a real shock across the U.S. government, and to see embassies attacked so boldly and brazenly suggested to senior policymakers from the president on down that they were dealing with a new and very dangerous foe here.
How did the Clinton administration respond to that attack? Do you recall?
So they started looking into, among other things, the use of force. And on August 20th, a few weeks after the attacks, they bomb Al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan. Our investigation found quite unambiguously that they were they were hoping to kill bin Laden in this attack. He happened not to have been there. They got unusual intelligence indicating that there was going to be a meeting in southern Afghanistan of a bunch of senior Al-Qaeda leaders, and we had Richard Clark, who was the counterterrorism coordinator, recalled George Tenet sitting next to him in the Situation Room, and I forget which of the two of them said it, but the CIA director, the White House counterterrorism coordinator, both heard about this big meeting of Al-Qaeda leaders and said, "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" And the U.S. then went ahead and bombed it. It was, I think, only the third time that the U.S. had used military force to respond to a terrorist attack in American history. After the bombing raid, which doesn't kill bin Laden, the National Security Council staff tries to get all the pistons firing as it should. It tries to get the Defense Department working on military plans for further strikes against Afghanistan. It tries to get the intelligence community working on better ways to try to find out what Al-Qaeda is up to, including trying to find ways where it can actually spot bin Laden and try to kill him with a cruise missile attack launched from a submarine offshore. It starts pushing for a renewed diplomatic push, including warning the government of Afghanistan, I'm sorry to say, but warning them of the consequences of harboring Al-Qaeda. So it's trying to push forward on all of these fronts. And the NSC staff at the time, led by Richard Clarke, calls this Operation Delenda, for the Latin word to destroy utterly. But there's a series of things that do flow out of that. The first is we start, at some point in 2000, we start flying drones over Afghanistan and see a figure, a tall man in a white robe at an Al-Qaeda camp in Kandahar.
And weren't at the time, these were unarmed drones, right? They weren't armed.
These are just reconnaissance predators. And they see this very tall guy in a white robe, and the CIA concludes that this is probably bin Laden, and they start talking about strapping Hellfire missiles from the Air Force onto these drones, which gets into a huge argument between the CIA and the Defense Department about who's going to pay for it. But hidden in the seeds of that argument is the roots of today's drone program. So that's one thread. There's another thread which leads to fears of a terrorist attack both inside the United States and abroad, either on our facilities or on our allies and partners, around the time of the millennium. And that includes the discovery that there is a jihadist named Ahmed Rassam who is discovered at the airport in British Columbia trying to come into the United States with a trunk full of bomb-making equipment and a map of LAX, the airport in Los Angeles. So this sends a big spin-up amongst the Clinton administration, who are very concerned that there's going to be an attack around the course of the millennium and surge a bunch of effort, domestic counterterrorism as well as foreign, to try to head that off.
This is where your investigation really starts. So is it fair to say that the bombings in 1998 were really the start of the story coming up to the 9/11 attacks?
From the point of view of pushing Al-Qaeda up onto a fairly high level on the agenda of senior policymakers, that's exactly right, Barbara. There had been Osama bin Laden had been on the radar screen of American intelligence officers for quite a long time, but there had been some real ongoing conversations about what his role was. There was a high-profile piece actually in the New York Times that really irritated President Clinton, in which bin Laden was described as mostly a money man, just a checkbook, just a financier of terrorism, not himself a terrorist operative, organizer, and mastermind. And that was, unfortunately, an inaccurate bit of reporting drove President Clinton crazy, and he circled it and sent it back to his Richard Clarke's team and saying, what's going on here?
So President Clinton authorizes a military strike following these attacks on our embassies. And the strikes do not achieve the objective that was hoped for, but it was an attempt to strike back. Do you recall what Congress's response to all of that was at the time? Because I've always thought that it was an opportunity lost then to really educate the public about what the threat of this sort of bizarre group from overseas actually was to the United States.
Well, I think this is one of these historians' things. The country was prosperous, wealthy, and, among other things, distracted with the Monica Lewinsky scandal and the impeachment of former President Clinton, which was going on right at the same time as this strike occurred. And there were some members of Congress who, instead of jumping up and saying, whoa, any terrorist group that can demolish 2 American embassies simultaneously is something that is of the highest priority, there were some people who started talking about whether President Clinton was, to use the name of a movie at the time, was trying to wag the dog, was looking for a pretext to use military force in a way that would boost his poll numbers and help him out of the domestic political position that he was in. The next major signpost was the bombing of the USS Cole in October 2000, right at the very end of the Clinton administration, while much of the Clinton administration's focus was on trying to hammer together an Israeli-Palestinian peace accord at Camp David. And this was Al-Qaeda took a small skiff, a small boat, loaded it up with explosives, and rammed it into the hull of the USS Cole, killing 17 sailors.
And where was that?
Off the coast of Yemen, which is now home to one of the most ferocious Al-Qaeda offshoots, known as Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. So this was a core Al-Qaeda attack. It was directed by bin Laden himself. They had tried to do a similar attack around the time of the millennium. Their boat at the time was trying to attack a ship called the USS the Sullivans. They overloaded the boat with too much explosives and it sank in Aden Harbor. They dredged the same boat back, tried it again a few months later, and killed 17 American sailors on the Cole.
And Warren, if this had been conducted by a nation or country, that clearly would have been an act of war.
No doubt. Attacking an American military vessel that's just sitting there, yes, that is a huge act of aggression.
Similarly, blowing up two embassies.
Absolutely.
But we find that there were actions taken after the 1998 embassy bombings, but we don't see similar actions taken in response to the Cole. Did we begin to understand why that happened?
One of the great frustrations of some of the core team of policymakers who worked on counterterrorism before 9/11 was the failure of both administrations to respond to the Cole. The Clinton administration spends a lot of time trying to work out who exactly is responsible for this and whether Al-Qaeda had command and control. They established fairly early on that some of these operatives who attacked the Cole had links back to Al-Qaeda, but get hung up on the question of whether bin Laden himself had said, go do it, here's an order, go attack the Cole. As it turned out, it was a bin Laden-directed operation, but the CIA was having some difficulties nailing down that piece of the puzzle. And the intelligence community was saying to the policymakers, wait, you have all the information that we have. You have to make a policy decision. We're not going to make that decision for you.
We would like to thank our sponsor, Carnegie Corporation of New York. The Philanthropic Foundation supports innovations in education, democratic engagement, and strengthening international peace and security. Learn more at carnegie.org.
We would like to thank the Wilson Center for sponsoring the Are We Safer Today podcast. The Wilson Center is the nation's key nonpartisan policy forum for tackling global issues through independent research and open dialogue to inform actionable ideas for the policy community.
So, Warren, this is such a rich area, and I think a lot of the public doesn't know a lot of these details, and you're expert on it. As I recall, neither candidate running for president in fall of 2000, Governor George W. Bush and Vice President Al Gore, really said much about the attack. They may have expressed grief, which is normal after it, but I don't think either outlined a plan for how to respond to it. And then I also recall, and correct me if I'm wrong, that I think we heard from Sandy Berger, the Clinton National Security Advisor, that they didn't act in response in part because they didn't want to tie the hands of the new administration that would be coming in a matter of a couple of months. Is that right?
I'm sure the Bush administration was touched by that solicitude. The Clinton people, it was October, the election was in November. They were still in office until the new president was sworn in January, but they definitely had a mindset that this was very late in the administration, and did they actually want to be engaging large military reprisal at this late hour in their administration? There were concerns from the State Department about the optics of attacking Muslim countries as they were trying to get the Israelis and Palestinians over the finish line of a final status deal at Camp David. And conversely, the incoming Bush administration viewed the Cole attack as being stale, that it happened on the previous guy's watch and it was no longer their responsibility. And Richard Clark was sending memos on Inauguration Day, in fact, to Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor, lamenting the fact that the Clinton administration had not militarily responded for the attack on the Cole, and urging the incoming George W. Bush team to respond at a time and place of its choosing and not to just let this vanish. Donald Rumsfeld, the new Secretary of Defense, and Paul Wolfowitz, his Deputy Secretary of Defense, they both thought that the Cole attack was stale and were not inclined to think about using force to retaliate for it.
And they told the commission that.
They did.
And perhaps it's an apocryphal story, but there's certainly stories that after there was no response to the Cole bombing or attack, that bin Laden said, well, what do I actually have to do to get a response? If that didn't get a response, what do I have to do? And that in some way led to his approval of the 9/11 plot.
I do know that bin Laden was expecting a military retaliation for the Cole, as there had been a military retaliation after the embassy bombings. And he was moving. He was going from safe house to safe house. He was worried that there was an American cruise missile out there with his name on it and wanted to be as mobile a target as he could be, and was, I think, legitimately surprised that there was no military response.
And Warren, where was DOD in all of this, Department of Defense? Certainly the generals wanted to strike back for having a warship attack, didn't they? Didn't they want to? Wouldn't you think they'd want to go in and rip up the camps in Afghanistan, the terrorist camps?
It was an ongoing struggle. Condoleezza Rice personally told us the Pentagon didn't particularly want that mission. That's a quote that's in the Commission's report. The State Department counterterrorism chief was so frustrated by the Pentagon's reluctance to think about using military force against Al-Qaeda targets that he told Richard Clarke, "Does Al-Qaeda have to attack the Pentagon to get their attention?" Which is an incredibly chilling remark in hindsight. There were senior officials at the Pentagon who thought that they were going to use a $1 million cruise missile to destroy a $50 jungle gym at some training camp in Afghanistan, and that Al-Qaeda would rebuild in 30 seconds, and that Al-Qaeda would jump up and say, "Hey, you missed us. We're still on our feet. We've taken your worst punch and we're still standing," and that it would make America look weak rather than powerful. So there was a genuine argument about this going on at the time. There was a lot of frustration with the Defense Department about its planning and willingness to think seriously about using military force.
I know there were at least some at the Department of Defense who saw the role of the military as really being a force protection role, that is, protecting their forces overseas from terrorist attacks rather than being an offensive capability against terrorists. And then sometimes, at least I recall, that DOD came forward with a proposal, and I always sort of called it the 200,000 or 250,000 sort of troop invasion of Afghanistan, multiple divisions sort of option that to present to a president was kind of clearly impractical because that wasn't ever going to happen at that point.
Well, the old Washington joke is that when it comes to use of force, the president usually gets three options. One is the Normandy invasion. The second is do absolutely nothing. And the third is the chosen course of action that the department is keen on. That's a bit of a caricature, but there was an ongoing question about which of these instruments of American national power were most effective in dealing with this Mercury-like, adaptive, faraway, relatively small-sized group of very determined and inventive foreign terrorists, and trying to figure out quite how dangerous they were.
Well, just a few months after the Cole attack, we started to hear the drumbeat of that there's going to be another big attack. A truck bomb in front of the White House, how many people could kill, and can you imagine if, hundreds of Americans were killed, what difference it would make? So you've got sort of his drumbeat. And what are you seeing happening in the rest of the administration in terms of what's happening in response to this drumbeat of there is going to be an attack? George Tenet, the director of CIA, is saying his hair is on fire, the system is blinking red. Is the White House responding?
And Warren, just to add on to Barbara's question, Richard Clarke kept the same title, I think, crossing from the Clinton administration to the Bush administration, but he wasn't in the same quite favored position that he had in the Clinton administration, I think.
No, Richard Clarke is a very hard-driving figure. He's one of the few, often senior officials who are running the offices at the National Security Council, which are called directorates. They're usually replaced between administrations. Condoleezza Rice decides that she wants to keep Clarke on because he's got a lot of institutional memory. Sandy Berger, who is Bill Clinton's national security advisor, had brought Clarke on because he wanted a bulldozer in this particular job. And incoming national security advisor Rice recognizes many of these strengths, but she also thinks that the structure that had been set up in the Clinton administration doesn't bureaucratically make very much sense. In the Clinton administration structure, if you had a meeting of cabinet rank officials, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, National Security Advisor, talking about counterterrorism, Richard Clarke would be there and would have a seat at the table. He wouldn't just be a staffer who got to sit in on the meeting and take some notes and maybe answer a factual question. He would be at the table as a principal. Condoleezza Rice did not think that that model made sense, that people who ran NSC directorates should certainly be in those meetings, but that the decisions should be made by the cabinet officers. She had Clarke removed from this role as a de facto principal on issues of counterterrorism, which was something that Clarke was very resentful over. He did not feel that the incoming Bush team was as seized with the threat of Al-Qaeda as its forebears in the Clinton administration had been. Clarke had gone through this quite scalding experience, as had most of the people who worked on counterterrorism, of seeing the surge in chatter in the spring and summer of 2001.
Chatter being communications.
Intercepted communications between Al-Qaeda operatives. Traditionally, this type of thing would be intercepting, reading someone's emails, intercepting a phone call, these types of things. And that gave a good sense of the degree of excitement within al-Qaeda circles that something quite large was being planned, something major, something unprecedented. And Clarke was exceptionally concerned about this. He tried to get some attention for this on the question of whether there would be a domestic terrorist attack, with the Millennium experience very much fixed in the back of his mind. Managed to get one meeting convened at the White House, bringing together some of the domestic agencies, but otherwise not a lot on the domestic front. People were mostly thinking that it would be happening abroad. And then the spike in chatter at a certain point falls off, and the bulk of the narrative goes back into an argument about these Predator drones being flown over Afghanistan, and between some questions about how to use them, about whether they should be flown as reconnaissance predators or as armed drones that would have the ability to kill bin Laden or other top al-Qaeda officials, and whether who would have their finger on the trigger. If someone thought they had spotted bin Laden, who would make the decision to take a strike with a drone, and the question of whether the CIA or the Pentagon would pay for this. And those arguments are all being worked through up until the time that the Bush administration's cabinet-level officials meet for the very first time about al-Qaeda, which is on September 4th of 2001. September 4th, just days before 9/11.
One of the challenges that the commission had was whether, in fact, we could publicly interview National Security Advisor Rice. Can you talk about how that came about, that we actually got her to appear in public, and what difference that made?
Sure. So the first thing that it's important to understand is that we had interviewed her in private. We had interviewed Steve Hadley, who was her deputy. We had interviewed Richard Clarke, who was on her staff. So we had access to her. The question of whether a senior White House official, as opposed to the head of a cabinet department like the State Department, the question of whether they could sit in front of the commission, and take questions from the commissioners was something the White House just hated that idea. They thought that White House staffers were in a separate category from Senate-confirmed cabinet officers. And in order to preserve this executive privilege that presidents claim to get unvarnished counsel for their advisors, they thought that it would be chilling to that type of counsel to have the National Security Advisor in the barrel in front of the commissioners, and they didn't want to do it.
Do you know why she changed her mind?
We'd done public interviews with Clarke, who was a very persuasive witness, had laid out his view of the Bush administration's shortcomings. The Bush administration had sent up Rich Armitage, who was the Deputy Secretary of State, Colin Powell's deputy, to try to answer some of those allegations, but Clarke still had a bunch of charges which were unrefuted. And Clarke had written a memoir of his experience in government and counterterrorism, and that book was coming out, and Clarke went on 60 Minutes and laid out some of his critique of the Bush administration, including his critique of his boss, Condoleezza Rice. And I think Dr. Rice and other White House policymakers decided that she was an extraordinarily smart and effective advocate for the administration, and that she had a side of the story, and that their best bet was to have her out there laying out these episodes as they looked from her point of view.
Can you talk about how all these things that you were learning actually got into the final report, and what kind of impact did all this work have?
I was taking quite detailed notes that were too detailed for the White House's taste about what the NSC staff had been doing on this. And we fed all of that back into Chapter 4, Chapter 6, Chapter 8 of the report, which were the chapters dealing with these policy questions and dealing with this huge surge in terrorist threat reporting in the summer of threat. There was lots of very clearly written material that really added a lot of power and drive and evidence to the final report.
Well, I think the statute of limitations is passed. My recollection is because you couldn't write detailed notes and then bring them back to the office, you would come back to the office and with your memory be able to recreate a number of your notes.
There was one document in particular, which was a memo that the counterterrorism coordinator, Richard Clark, wrote to his boss, National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, in advance of this cabinet rank meeting on Al-Qaeda on September 4th. And I thought that it was an exceptionally important document. And the question was how we were going to get it out of there, because we had these rules that said you could not fully recreate the document in the report. I can read just a smidge of it. I reread it before coming in today. And Clark said, the real question before the principals is, quote, are we serious about dealing with the Al-Qaeda threat? Is Al-Qaeda a big deal? And then in italics he wrote, decision makers should imagine themselves on a future day when the CSG, his committee, has not succeeded in stopping Al-Qaeda attacks and hundreds of Americans lay dead in several countries, including the U.S., what would those decision makers wish that they had done earlier? That future day could happen at any time. That was on September 4th, and I thought the public needed to hear it.
Fascinating.
That is still haunting to me. So here we are, 18 years after we did this work together. Is there something you'd go back and do differently? You know, as you said, in hindsight, you can always view things differently. Is there something you would have done differently?
I would have hired about 5 more staffers for our team. It was a lot of work. We got it all done. And I don't think that there was anything that we left out of the report or didn't chase down to the best of our ability because we were a small team. But we were a small team, and to get to the degree of result and professionalism that we thought the public was owed was just exhausting. We were happy to do it. We thought there was nothing more important. We felt a particular debt to the families without whom the commission would not have been set up, and we wanted to give the public the best accounting that we possibly could of this shocking and terrible and terrifying event. I'm pretty proud of the job that we did.
As far as you know, do the findings of the 9/11 Commission report stand up in general pretty well today still?
As far as I know, they do. There are some questions that will always breed conspiracy theories, and some of those conspiracy theories are bred by people who are just frankly malicious, and no amount of evidence is actually going to dissuade them. My focus was always on the fair-minded person who was trying to work out what the hell had happened to their country, what the hell had happened on that day, and in particular for family members who are trying to work out how their loved one had been murdered and taken from them so shockingly. We told the story to the best of the quite considerable ability of the formidable team that Philip Zelikow and Chris Kojum and Dan Marcus and the commissioners had assembled, and I'm very proud to have worked on it. And I'm proud of the spirit of bipartisanship that the commissioners brought to their work. I'm proud of the fact that they came to a unanimous report. I'm proud of the fact that they worked well together as a team. Some of them are no longer with us, and I think of someone like Slade Gorton, former Republican senator from Washington, and I wish we could have his counsel right now. It was an honor to have worked with some of those people.
Amen.
Warren, some of our listeners were not born when we were attacked on September 11th, 2001. What would you say to those individuals about the work of the commission and its relevance today, so many years later?
I would tell them that there is a pretty fascinating government report out there that's unlike any other government report that had come up beforehand, that was written with a real insistence on readability, which will not only be a masterclass into the way the U.S. government works and doesn't work, but will also give you an incredible window into this hinge moment in American history. It's also a reminder of the importance of a new type of 21st century threat, of transnational threats that don't care about borders. And that can be a terrorist group, that can be an international drug trafficking syndicate, it can be climate change, or to take one completely hypothetical example, it can be a global pandemic that kills 1 million Americans, hundreds of thousands of them completely needlessly. And I think that the 9/11 report is an example of how dangerous some of these new 21st century breeds of threats can be and how important it is to take them seriously, try to get ahead of the curve, and try to do something that's extraordinarily difficult inside government, which is to try to find ways of institutionalizing imagination. That's incredibly difficult to do, but it's also incredibly important to our national security.
Warren Bass, thanks for your fascinating insights and a really, really great conversation.
Thanks so much. It's an honor.
Thanks, Warren. Warren helped piece together the Commission's puzzle by investigating how 2 successive administrations approached the Al-Qaeda threat. They were part of a team of almost 100 staff who had a very short amount of time to accomplish an unprecedented task. One of the most difficult challenges was to coordinate and direct the work of all these talented individuals, spread across the 9 different investigative teams and front office personnel, each one tackling different aspects of the Commission's work. All of them had to be supported, directed, pushed, pulled, and otherwise cajoled to get this huge task done on time. Our guest on the next episode of the Are We Safer Today podcast, Chris Kojum, was central to that difficult job.
That was the representation. The reality, of course, turned out to be very, very different. And so it was apparent to me, and of course to the chair and vice chair, why the director of the CIA did not want access to the detainees. They were covering up a record of horror and torture.
Chris Kojum was the Deputy Executive Director of the Commission staff. He worked closely with the commissioners and Staff Director Philip Zelikow to orchestrate the staff's work and to put all the puzzle pieces together. Join us as we continue to explore through the eyes of investigators the most extensive investigation in U.S. history.
Thank you for listening to the Are We Safer Today podcast. This was made possible thanks to our sponsors, Carnegie Corporation of New York and the Wilson Center.
I'm Barbara Gruey.
I'm Mike Hurley. This is the Are We Safer Today podcast. Thanks for listening.
If you enjoyed this podcast, be sure to check out the Are We Safer Today documentary film. In it, the 9/11 commissioners discuss their historic work, what they did and how they did it. Available in broadcast or streaming from your local public television station or pbs.org/video. Special thanks to the Center on Representative Government at Indiana University, along with Paul and Cindy Simon Scott and the Sumerian Foundation. Are We Safer Today is a production of Naptown Media. Executive producer Bob Massey. Produced by Shelby Hiltunen with associate producer Emily Twergel. Editors Matt Massey and PJ Wilson. Recorded at Interface Media Group in Washington, D.C. with sound engineer Dennis Jacobson. Thanks to Sarah Jackson and Grant McPollen. Theme music by House Music and Sound.